Hi, everybody. It's 12 o'clock. My name is Stacy Eagle-Elk, and I am the program manager for the Great Plains Tribal Opioid Response Program. I want to thank you for joining us today for the growing negative impacts to communities, family, and children, a collaborative conversation, a resilience collaborative conversation. I want to first of all say thank you to SAMHSA, the Great Plains Native Connection Program, Great Plains HPOG, and Great Plains EPI programs for making this available today and partnering with us to bring all these fabulous presenters together. A few housekeeping items on the list is if you have any questions, if you could please use the question Q&A box, and we will get to those. We'll filter those out to Tiffany and Heather. And I want to say thank you to Heather and Heather. Is it Boxrud, Heather?
Yeah, it's Boxrud.
Okay, Boxrud, and also Tiffany Petro from the Children's Home Society. Heather was born and raised in Hettinger, North Dakota. She graduated from Hettinger High School. After high school, she went into getting 2 associate degrees at Bismarck State College. After that, she went on to Black Hills State University to graduate with a bachelor's degree in human services and psychology in 2015. After graduation, Heather pursued her career in child welfare in both Montana and North Dakota. Heather found herself back in the Black Hills when she completed an internship at Compass Point and Spearfish for addiction counseling as pursuant to her MSW. After that internship, she has been at Children's Home Society since the end of August of 2020. So welcome. She's still, I would consider you new, but they don't probably consider you new, as the Education and Public Specialist and Community Navigator. She will graduate with her MSW from the University of Denver in August of 2021. And I'll say congratulations to you, Heather, on that. Tiffany Petro, MS, serves as the Director of Advocacy and Prevention, overseeing the Children's Home Child Advocacy Center and multiple statewide awareness and education campaigns. In addition to overseeing the collaborative investigations of child abuse cases, Tiffany provides forensic interviews for local, state, federal, and tribal jurisdictions and comprehensive trainings rooted in understanding trauma and recognizing and responding to child abuse. Tiffany believes that by empowering children, we can create resilient families and communities. Tiffany received her BS degree in psychology from the Black Hills State University, her MS in public health from Capella University, Minnesota, and her MS in human services from Capella University, Minnesota. I want to thank you both of you ladies for being here today and welcome you to Illegal Drugs and Opioids in Indian Country. And I'll just turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Stacy, for that warm welcome, and thank you all of you that are joining us. Super excited and honored to be asked to be part of this collaborative experience of just education. I understand from Stacy that you have all had a variety of different topics about the issues that are facing communities across South Dakota. So thank you for showing up and attending this. I do really encourage questions. Heather and I love questions. So please feel free to interrupt or add or share resources, because I want to honor that we also have other experts in this virtual room. And so honoring all of the wisdom and knowledge that you all bring to this as well. So as we start to dive in, I want to start off with a reflection question. People that know me know that I love to ask these "what about you" questions. And so the way I think about lived experience as we move through our lives is that I kind of equate it to a little suitcase. And in that little suitcase are all of the experiences that make us up, both good and bad. And we fold it up and we pack our little suitcase. And When we manage our suitcase, right, when we manage all of these life experiences, when we hit a bump in the sidewalk, nothing really happens. The suitcase might jostle a little bit and we get to rearrange it. We might repack it, but we can go on about our day, right? We can be resilient, we can be collaborative, we can call out for others. But what happens for individuals when their suitcase maybe has more negative experiences than positive experiences? Or maybe nobody taught them how to pack their suitcase and everything's just shoved in there. Have you ever seen a visual of a suitcase where everything's shoved in there and you have to like sit on it and try to get it closed and sleeves are sticking out the side, right? What happens to those suitcases when we're walking down the sidewalk and we hit a bump? All over the place, right? We can feel that and experience that trauma just kind of spilling out. Often for individuals facing adversities or toxic stress moments, sometimes it's about nobody taught them how to pack their suitcase. Nobody taught them how about like resilience and coping mechanisms. And that tends to be how trauma works, right? It kind of spills out all over the place. So how is your suitcase today? Is it packed well? Is it organized? Is it a mess? Is it overflowing? Wherever you find yourself, I hope that you're taking some personal inventory. So where I want to invite you right now is I want you to write down 3 words on a piece of paper, scribble it, take out your phone and write it on a note in a note section. I want you to write 3 things that describe you. So I have 2 older sisters, and so often the word that was used to describe me as the youngest was bossy. I like to call it motivated or leadership qualities. But tell us about your 3 things. Think about it. What describes you? Are you bold? Are you strong? Are you opinionated? Are you certain? Right? Are you anxious, nervous, scared, sad? What are 3 things that describe you on a piece of paper? And if you are so bold, I would encourage you to find your chat box and just jot down a few. Tell us, share with the group now and tell us what are the 3 words that describe you, or one of the 3 words. Heather, how about you? What's one of your words?
Well, the one that keeps coming to my mind is how my husband loves to describe me, and he describes me as a sponge. I have 2 sides to me. I have the soft and nice side, and then I have the, what he likes to call, abrasive side. But that is my tougher, harder edge side, where sometimes you need to have that. But that is what comes to mind with me, and he refers to me as a sponge. I can absorb it all, but then I can also put up my barriers at the same time.
Very good. And I see some in chat. Thank you for those that are sharing. And capable, progressive, giving, compassionate, independent. So often we're kind, faithful, tough. Yes, absolutely. Keep them coming. So often we're quick to describe things or see things about us as negative, right? It would be really easy for Heather to take that abrasive sponge analogy and see that as something that might not be positive in a community setting. But what if I told you that you could survive your toughest moments based on those characteristics? That those were things, those were tools that were packed away in your suitcase that helped you overcome and move forward. So Heather's going to talk a little bit about types of stress and trauma and things for us to consider as we're unpacking all of this information about how does this play out in our communities. Heather?
Thanks, Tiffany. And I love all of the chat and the communication in the chat box, so keep it coming because I do have some questions for everyone as we go. So please feel free to use that chat box. It helps Tiffany and I out a lot, knowing that people are actually engaging with us. So to begin with, let's define what stress is and what different types of stress are. So we have this lovely visual with positive, tolerable, and toxic. So I think for us right now, we should really just dive into what is positive stress, what is tolerable, what is toxic. So positive stress is essentially a stress response that can be alleviated with the assistance of a caring or responsive adult who can help the child cope with the stressor. And so when we are talking today, we bring everything back to how kiddos react. We will talk about ACEs, adverse childhood experiences and stuff, and kind of pull that in. And so essentially, what that means is in the presence of a caring or responsible adult, there's a protective factor that allows children to respond to stress and be able to return back to their baseline. Kind of like this is a great positive stress for me. As much as I love giving presentations and getting the word out there, there's a stress that comes with it. And so knowing that it is a positive stress because I have Tiffany as my support system, and I am hers back and forth. And then, knowing that this is how we really can move through life. And some examples of those stressors when we talk about it with children or with some of the clients that we've been working with, they deal with frustration, anxiety, anything else that's really environmental, but being able to work through that and be able to come back to that normal, quote unquote, normal or baseline state is what positive stress really is. So we have tolerable stress. And that is a stress response that is associated with exposure of non-normative experiences that has a greater magnitude of adversity or threat. So examples of this would be like a death of a family member, a serious illness or injury, a natural disaster, an act of terrorism. But what makes this stress response tolerable is having that protective system, that adult, that relationship, that person that you can be there and rely on and be able to cope and gain that sense of control back. So this helps reduce the physiological stress response and promote us to go back to that baseline that we've talked about. And then when we talk about toxic stress, this is the exposure of stressful and adverse experiences over a long period of time that then become toxic. And this repeated exposure to stress without the benefit of buffering protection of supportive and adult relationships has termed the name toxic stress. So several adverse life experiences can contribute to toxic stress. So when we talk about the ACE study, adverse childhood experiences, we talk about the neglect, abuse, divorce and separation, domestic violence, any of those things that are in that 10 questionnaire on that ACE study can be toxic stress. And so knowing that the exposure of toxic stress can have a detrimental impact on both short-term and long-term physical and mental health consequences on both children and adults. And so we just went over the 3 different types of stress. Some are good, some are not so good. We'd all love to live in that positive stress area, but we know that that's not possible. And so I have a question for you, and just feel free to type it into the chat box, but what is the main difference for you then between tolerable stress and toxic stress? Yes, Tiffany will love to give it away. Having that support system. That is the main difference is tolerable stress and toxic stress really mirror each other. But if we have that strong support system, that's what can pull it out of toxic. And we'll really dive into that with the resiliency of our community and of everyone else involved. So then we need to also define what is trauma. This is huge when we talk about everything that is going on. So in thinking about trauma and different types of trauma, I want you to use the chat box and give us some examples of trauma that clients have experienced that they've come to you about, or that you have experienced in yourself. And just think about these. If you don't feel comfortable with using the chat box, that's okay. But think about these different types of trauma as we really define what each one is on this slide. So yes, death and grief, that's a huge one. So when we talk about what is trauma, public trauma, this is something that is experienced on a grand scale that doesn't necessarily impact you directly, but can have that negative feeling of impact because it has occurred, or in a public event that triggers emotions for you. This can be something like a natural disaster, or for me right now, thinking about it, I have a very good friend who lives in Boulder, Colorado. And the shooting that happened in Colorado affected me because I knew where she lived, and she went on Facebook and had to mark herself as safe. So knowing that that wasn't something that impacted me personally. I don't live in Colorado. I wasn't there. I don't know any of the victims personally, but yet it affected me still. And so that is a trauma. We also look at natural disasters such as like flooding, famine. I think of Snowstorm Atlas. Every time that we get a snowstorm now after Atlas, I kind of get worried about, oh, am I going to be in my house again for 8 days without power? Like that affected all of us on a different level. So then personal trauma, this is the trauma that you experience personally, or it happens to someone close to you. So when we talk about that, I just brought up Boulder's shootings and how that can go from public to personal very quickly, as if my friend would have been one of the victims in there. That would have turned into a personal trauma for me then, versus it being a public trauma. So then interpersonal violence, that really tends to be more traumatic than like natural disasters, because it is more disruptive to our fundamental sense of trust and attachment. And this is typically experienced as intentional rather than just an act of nature. This violates our very core that we trust in others. And this is the most difficult trauma to heal from. So when we talk about the ACE study and our loss of trust and attachment within the prominency of the ACE study, it is easy to understand how that can be most difficult to heal from. Then we'll talk about historical and intergenerational. This one is huge, especially in South Dakota, with the group that we have on board with us today. You guys know all about this. And so knowing that this trauma can impact future generations due to repeated behavior or belief, or a cellular change that is passed on with or without the knowledge or awareness. So this can impact entire groups. So when we talk about the Native American culture and the negative impacts that Native Americans continue to face, especially in South Dakota on our rural reservations, this can impact the individual families on a smaller level, but it can also impact the Native American culture as a whole. And how we look at it and we see how people believe and how they parent and how they respond to trauma. What diseases are they prone to? This is all embedded within that generational trauma. And so when we talk about intergenerational trauma, we have to bring up that lovely word of epigenetics. And we have to know that cells are directed by our DNA, but we have also learned that our DNA isn't this foolproof puzzle that you put it together and this is how it's going to be forever. We've learned it's more of like a switchboard. And so then knowing that it can turn things on and off, and that it can actually change how things actually can become. So if you have cells in your DNA that are possible for, like, let's say diabetes or a mutation of something else, that diabetes switch can be turned on or it can be turned off. So just knowing that preventing something from happening is a possibility also. And this can happen during infancy and all throughout our life. So whether we have something that's turned on through our DNA or outside resources, such as we look at diabetics, and some preterm diabetics are told, well, if you diet and exercise, diabetes won't be prominent. So knowing that outside sources such as that can also impact our DNA and our cells, or even the trauma. So knowing that the trauma that my mom experienced, I truly experienced myself also. So just because my mom passed on, she didn't pass on her good hair. She has horrible hair. I got that from my dad. But she could pass on her, I mean, I love Diet Mountain Dew, and so does she. And so knowing that some of those things that we can pass on through our cells can also be passed on through trauma. So knowing that as we dive deeper into this, knowing that intergenerational trauma is real and we've all experienced it. And so when we look at chronic versus single, ongoing trauma is essentially chronic. And so this trauma is repeated due to the change in behavior that a person is impacted, or the person is acting out trauma-related incidences. And this is usually a result of the change behavior or for those DNA and cell changes. So prolonged exposure to repetitive or severe events such as child abuse can cause most severe and long-lasting effects. So treatment of acute or one-time trauma may be easier to administer care for. And so knowing that there's a process of resolving the imminent trauma and then seeking help. And then this allows the person to seek help sooner. So if it is a one-time single event, it is easier to be able to get the help for that versus then something that is chronic. So when we talk about child abuse or neglect, if that is chronic in that household, it's not just a one-time isolated incident. So we really need to open our hearts and hear some stories about abuse and trauma and the beliefs that can be challenged and how we can be changed. So the result of hearing from traumatic experiences can really change how we work. And so we need to understand that as we dive deeper into this, we're going to talk about that resiliency and how can we move on from this trauma and how can we essentially build from it. And also, how can we use our compassion that we have without burning out and losing that for our clients and for ourselves. So as we talked a little bit about DNA and everything, we talk about the first spark of life and how like cells divide in that tiny beating heart and the fragile skeletal structure and the central nervous system and all of the other stuff that make up that little baby. The experience of being in a relationship with another person in the world starts immediately. And so I'll just let you know, I am 9 months pregnant right now. And I have a daughter growing inside of me, and knowing that I have that connection with her already. And knowing that that impacts who she's going to be and who she will become someday. And although we can recall a lot of our events with words and stuff like that, we have some of those human experiences that are stored in our bodies and not just our minds. So when we talk about it, this is really those issues in our tissues. So essentially, what affects me affects my daughter. And thank you for the congratulations. And so when we talk about the ACE study, that tells us that from the moment that my daughter was placed in the womb until the day she arrives, she is experiencing what I am experiencing. She is going through all of that. So depending on the type of stress that I experience and the environment that my daughter will grow up in will really greatly impact the development of her brain as a whole. And so then when we talk about the brain and trauma, we have to talk about brain development. So there's three main parts of the brain that we'll kind of dive into today. And the brainstem is the oldest. So this is essentially, the brainstem controls our arousal and our automatic response. So essentially this is our survival mode. This is where that comes into play. Then the limbic region. This evolved next. It includes the amygdala, which is the brain's smoke detector essentially, and the hippocampus. And so this connects the highs and the low parts of the brain. It is responsible for the experience and the expression of emotion or for memory. So knowing that that part that developed secondly in my daughter has emotion and memory attached to that already. And then the cortex is developed last. And so this allows the person to reflect. So this is the area of cognition and thinking. This is where the prefrontal cortex is a part and is involved with concentration and the higher brain functions. So looking at how the brain develops is also important is also important to know. So knowing that it starts with the brainstem and then the limbic system and then the cortex comes, knowing that it doesn't just develop all at once, it grows upon each other, is important when we talk about development and trauma, and looking that some parts of the brain grow and develop rapidly at certain ages, where overwhelming stress or childhood adversity can affect the way the brain develops. So during critical periods of development, trauma can badly affect different areas, but yet positive experiences can also help with development, and negative experiences can impair development. So knowing that, we talk about adverse childhood experiences all the time. Well, they're talking about positive childhood experiences also. And knowing that when we start talking about resiliency, that is what we're talking about, is being able to help with that part of the brain. And so knowing that, like, our hippocampus, it's smaller, and it really is where our attention and our learning come into play. So if we have a child who had an adversity when their hippocampus was developing, knowing that that ability to pay attention and learn will continue to affect them throughout their entire lives. So when we talk about it with addictions and stuff, and why can't this person sit still? Why can't they pay attention? Sometimes we need to think back and think, where were they at when that part of their brain was developing? And we also need to know that the amygdala function is huge, because that can make a person more likely to react or trigger, especially emotional. So people can experience emotional extremes and struggle to regulate their emotions. So when we talk about the changes in the amygdala and where the child was at when their amygdala was developing, knowing that that continues to affect them today. So if you have somebody who is having all these outbursts and you can't figure out what's going on, we need to take a step back. What was going on with them when that part of their brain was developed? And then we will talk about some ways in which historical trauma really affect our health. And so at this point in time, I want to hold that space for historical and intergenerational trauma. These are words that are used very frequently throughout the ACE study, and for very important reasons. A few slides back, we talked about the issues in our tissues, and that is something that you will always hear when we talk about the ACE study, is issues in our tissues. And knowing that this is because adversity can pass through that DNA. And then we look at the idea of nature versus nurture. But just as we can pass adversity through DNA, we can also pass our resiliency through our DNA. So in talking about passing resiliency through nature versus nurture, we understand protective factors. And each of us have a reason why we're here today, why you decided to be where you're at and go into the job field you are in, and what we've been resilient throughout our life, and how that has taught us, and who taught us that, and who taught us how to be that resilient person.
I gotta take myself off mute. Thank you for all that information, Heather. So hopefully you're starting to have some aha moments as you've been attending this series and understanding the influence of things like opioids in Indian country, but also the why behind the behavior. I'm very transparent about the fact that I've been in social work for 12 years, and gosh, I would have been better. I would have been so much better if I would have had some of this information about how trauma impacts us in our formative years. Although trauma doesn't explain everything, or the exposure to trauma doesn't explain everything, there are individuals who have good, healthy childhoods that still face adversity. It's important to understand the context when we start to talk about things that we want to see changed within our community, within our systematic systems, and within ourselves as well. For those of us that are working with adults and not just children, or holistically the whole family, it's important to know that that exposure to that ongoing toxic stress, remember that's the stress that Heather talked about, without hope, without feeling like we have help or opportunities to make changes, that can start to hardwire the way that we see and interact with the world around us. Now, fundamentally for children, our stress response hardwires in our early 20s. Now, that doesn't mean that we'll always be a fighter or a runner or a freeze person, but it does start to give insight into how that child is going to respond when the stress becomes too much. So the slide that's up there right now shows the difference between stress response, right? So remember, this takes place in the amygdala. When we're talking with kids, we call the amygdala amygdala, and she's kind of a pain, right? Her whole job is to look out for danger. And what we know from brain research is that individuals who experience large amounts of toxic stress during their formative years, their Amy gets really active, and she's always looking for danger. So if you remember Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right, the triangle, the bottom part of the triangle talks about safety. Now, what we know now is that safety means psychological, physical, emotional, basic needs being met. But that's the foundation. And if those needs aren't met, we know in our work that clients find it harder to move out of that space of always looking for danger. Fundamentally, our bodies are meant to keep us alive and safe. If you're in the forest and there's a bear, Amy perks up and she says, "Danger, we need to do something about it." In a moment's notice, your body will decide how it's going to respond. We actually don't get to choose if we're going to fight, flight, or freeze. Our body makes that decision based on our ability. This is important for those of us that are working with survivors, like we do here at the Child Advocacy Center. A lot of sexual assault survivors tend to freeze, and society is quick to pass judgment on that. But I always want to hold space for the fact that, gosh, if you survived, then your body did exactly what it was meant to do. So you're in the forest and there's a bear. Amy says, "Danger, we need to get out of here." Your body will make that decision, and typically it's a fight or flight, but then you're allowed to come down from that, right? So you come down, you're activated, and then you come down. Body returns to normal, starts to shed some of that active energy. And that's how the cycle of being activated or triggered or having experience of a traumatic way works in our body in a normal, typical fashion. I say normal because nothing's really that normal. Now imagine that you live with the bear. You come home to the bear's at your dining room table, the bear's in your classroom, the bear is at work, it might be your boss, right? What happens when you are constantly exposed to the bear? Our brains are only meant to handle toxic stress for 20 minutes at a time. Think about the last challenging time where you felt overwhelmed, you didn't have hope, you felt discouraged. 20 minutes. At 21 minutes, you're getting too much of those toxic chemicals. Now, for adults, even after the age of 25, when your brain is fully developed, all of those chemicals washing over your brain will start to change the way that you see and interact with the world around you. For those of you that are working with survivors, or you're working with individuals that are struggling with substance use or misuse, or individuals that are experiencing adversity, you too are at danger of having too much of that stress wash over you. So what that looks like, both for children that have grown up in adversity, or for adults who are at risk of choosing what we call unhealthy coping skills, such as the use of substances to manage or self-medicate in a way, is that their window of tolerance gets shorter. So if you think about it, at birth, we're born with all the brain cells that we're ever going to need, right? And we essentially have the same window that everybody else does for how we respond to stress. Now, as children, we start to hardwire to survive in the environment in which we're growing up. And so our window will adjust based on our environment. And remember, children are egocentric, which means everything revolves around them. And so when the baby cries and mom doesn't come, they don't know that she has postpartum depression. They just know she's not coming. Or when the toddler acts out and dad responds or mom responds negatively, they don't know that that's not about them. It might be the only way that dad interacts with them, right? And so our window of tolerance starts to flex. And as we get older, when we face adversity, which we know happens, it starts to flex. And so essentially when we're constantly being exposed, to toxic elements, to the stories of somebody surviving, to lived experiences, but we don't process through that, our window of tolerance can change as well. And so here's where the optimal zone is, right? That's in the open window, right? You experience empathy, you have tolerable feelings, you're okay to be around, you're present and you're mindful. So self-awareness check. How's your window? Is it a little low or is it a little high? What we find with individuals with lived experience or those that have experienced traumatic stress is that their window tends to be a little bit smaller. And all that means is that they tend to get pushed outside of those regulation zones a little bit quicker. So they become more easily activated or agitated. Their fight flight response, too much arousal, they can be shaky, be defensive, they can have racing thoughts, they can have intrusive imagery, feel unsafe, anger, rage, impulsivity. Can anyone think of an adult that they know like that, that's quick to respond, to react? You also might get an individual who is in their parasympathetic immobilization response. They're not aroused enough, world happens to them. That's where we hear the why bother, it doesn't matter, I'm a victim mentality, in the sense of things just happen to me, I'm shut down, I'm passive. How's your window? I'm going to ask again. When we think about where individuals are at when they choose to unhealthy coping skills like self-medication, and understand that self-medicating can happen with a variety of things, not just substances, right? Addiction to the exercise, you can get addicted to food, you can get addicted to your technology, right? Anything can become unhealthy when it's becoming unbalanced, right? And so what this looks like is uncooperative, angry outbursts. They may be inattentive, daydreaming, having a hard time remembering things. They might have a change in their personality, be withdrawn. They may start self-harming or self-blaming. You may see school or work failure. I want to hold space, and I'm not an expert here, but I had someone share who does a lot of work in this space with individuals that are self-harming versus those that have have a plan to die by suicide. That self-harming doesn't always equate that there is a desire to end their life. Often for youth, especially, is where this person specializes in. She was sharing that through her clinical work, she's found that individual children, since they have a hard time processing their emotions, that feelings become very gray and messy for them. But the physical pain of cutting, I understand pain, but just like with any other addiction or coping mechanism, when it doesn't give me the same release or control or thrill or excitement, whatever it is, go a little deeper. I do things that are a little bit more extreme, and sometimes that can result in the loss of a life. But understanding that regardless, those individuals are seeking out for help because there's something going on that they're not able to process or verbalize. So if we go one step further down, kind of down on the iceberg, it's going to cause this trauma, and these traumatic experiences are going to cause issues in how we integrate our memories. And people can get stuck in this feeling space, this space of not being able to make sense of that traumatic experience or what has happened to them. Remember, there are two halves of the brain. The left hemisphere is the logical, sensical, kind of factual side, and your right side of your brain is where your emotions and you feel from. Some people can get stuck in that feeling phase of their experiences. Again, that until you can start to integrate those, and I would refer to the therapeutic experts that I see and know are in this room, sometimes getting individuals to integrate that experience is what helps them move on. I will share this, I share it often at trainings, but never in the history of calm down has that actually been effective in telling someone to calm down, right? So just my tip for the day. This is going to lead to a difficulty for that individual or ourselves to emotionally regulate, to comfort someone else or to be comfort, and to stay present. What we know about those that have lived with traumatic experiences is that although we are hardwired for connection, those that need it the most have the hardest time asking for that connection. They have a hard time accepting trust and help. Now, as caregivers, loved ones, professionals, that can be pretty frustrating for you, right? Especially when you're working with somebody who wants to do better, but is just struggling to overcome their addictions, their demons, their issues in their tissues, whatever verbiage you prefer. It becomes very difficult for an individual to accept, receive, and honestly feel worthy of receiving that help. Which means on the day-to-day practice, you are going to be working alongside of adults, connecting with adults through work or just your family member, and their fundamentally just day-to-day practices are going to get more difficult. They might have a hard time deciding even the simplest of things. So I can think of when I am dysregulated, or when I have had a long day, or I've done a lot of trainings. As much as I love trainings, my brain is done. And I go home and I am just not regulated. My window is closed and my husband goes, "What do you want to eat?" Something even as simple as that, I'd be like, I am done making decisions. Anybody else with me? Just me. Don't ask me what I want to eat. But even being thoughtful and being present. And so for professionals, again, because I know so many of you are doing such amazing work within the communities that you live and reside in, understanding that this piece of, let me back up and build that better. For those that are doing this work, often we all come with our own lived experience of varying degrees and varying types of experiences. Understanding that when we come to this space of helping others, we have to make sure our own suitcase is packed. We have to make sure that we're regulated, because what you see on this screen right now are warning signs that you need to take care of you. So on all of this work, if nobody in these, I hope somebody has said it before in these training series, but please take care of you, because the problems in the community will continue to be there, but we need people like you that care enough to do something about it. So there's my PSA for taking care of yourself. So ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences, have been connected scientifically to adversities that adults face. We know that if you experience trauma in the formative years, your first 18 years of life, that you are at a higher risk. Now, that doesn't mean that you will absolutely face adversity. I have an ACE score of 3, and it just means that I'm at higher risk for health problems or health and social problems. But you know what my ACE score doesn't tell you? It doesn't tell you how resilient I am. It doesn't tell you how much work I put into taking care of myself or not put into taking care of myself. It doesn't tell me how awesome you are or all the things that you find interesting and amazing. But it can tell me that when we think about what is going on in our community and the things that we'd like to be changed, a large percentage of those social problems can be attributed to those with high ACE scores or high levels of trauma. This is a slide from the original ACE study, and I love that it gives a snapshot of different types of adversities that communities might face. And so so how the charts work is across the bottom, it'll tell you, like, that's how high your ACE scores go, right? So the more experiences you've had, the higher risk you might have in developing these adversities. So everything from anxiety to cancer to asthma. This is the story of epigenetics, historical trauma, intergenerational adversity, how things play out through our experiences. So Douglas, thank you for that. Weight and weight gain is not on here. This is not all inclusive, right? This is just a snapshot of a few things. But there are a lot of health things such as weight and weight gain that can be attributed to high ACE scores. Absolutely, thank you for pointing that out. I want to pause and ask you guys if there's any thoughts. What comes to mind? So Douglas was able to share that initial, hey, this is missing. What other thoughts are prompted when you think about your community, your family members, your workplaces? What resonates when you see these numbers of what could be these adversities attributed to high trauma scores? And I know it takes some time to type, so we'll give you some space to do that. Yeah. Alcohol is not on here. What other thoughts? What might be true for your communities if we're thinking about social adversities? Workplace issues. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So this is what we call an oil slick slide. So trauma is interrelated. What we know about from the ACEs study is that 87% of the time, if you reported one ACE, you were more than likely going to have a second ACE. What we know is that children in residential facilities across South Dakota have an average ACE score of 6 to 7. Now an ACE score, because we didn't quite go into that here, is based on a 10-question questionnaire as part of the original ACE studies. If you come visit us next week, we'll dive into it. By visit, I mean on this webinar. And children sitting in basic foster care have an average of 3 to 4 ACE scores. And that questionnaire, if you've seen it, if you're familiar with it, you'll know that it's not all inclusive. And there are a lot of things that children and families face that are not accounted for. But what this study did is it gave us a huge amount of data. And what we can extrapolate through the science is that these percentages can be attributed to high ACE scores. Now, again, I've said it once, I'll say it again, trauma doesn't explain everything. But when we think about IV drug use, 78% of all IV drug use can be attributed to high ACEs, 65% of alcoholism, 61% of incarceration as adults. This begs us to ask a different question. Instead of why do you keep choosing this? Why do you keep doing this? We need to start asking what happened to you? How did you get here? A simple shift in that narrative can create a different opportunity to connect and engage. We don't have to tell people that opioids and meth and smoking and things like that are unhealthy choices for them. They already know that. But if we really truly want to make an impact, then we'll start with a different question. We'll start with a different perspective. Now, the beautiful thing about oil slicks is that we don't have to fix everything all at once. Because of the way that trauma is interrelated, we can stay passionate about the space that we're in, right? I can stay passionate about helping kids who are victims of crime, and you can stay passionate about helping individuals find and regain freedom from substance use. All we have to do is think about it like this. If I put a paper towel in the middle of this oil slick and it absorbed 1%, it's going to take 1% off this entire oil slick. That means alcoholism goes down to 64%, painkillers to get high goes down to 53%, and the entire community gets healthier because we made an impact in even just one area. Which begs the question that we have to start asking what's going on in our community. Because this is not a conversation about them versus us. This is a we conversation. If we truly want to see change and a change in ways that people move through their life, then we have to look holistically at the entire community. This is a training that we give to law enforcement here in Pennington County. We often talk about, this is about parent to professionals, so those with lived experiences should know about how they might have been impacted by their environment. So when you think about adverse childhood experiences, when you think about how we get to this place of opioid addiction, we have to also look at what is our community doing? What kind of supports are missing? What kinds of things have to be changed about zip codes and systematic racism and oppression, right? All of it has to be looked at because they all play a role in how people respond to their lived experiences. One study looked at as much as 10% of unhealthy coping mechanisms essentially can be attributed to how safe someone feels in their zip code. So just in like, how am I in my community, right? So we have to take into this as a holistic perspective. So what challenges might be present in implementing this in your community? Enduring racism, absolutely, Mike. Racism and systematic racism are big issues for sure. So what do you think might prevent communities from making this change? Absolutely, Stacy. What do you think needs to be changed in your communities? Limited support, absolutely, Jalen. Thank you for that. What else? fear of messing up, access to education, how to bring people together through unity. Housing, right? Affordable and accessible housing. Something like equitable pay, access to medical care. Yes, absolutely, Stacy. Destigmatizing asking for help or mental health or substance use. So we can all agree that there are a lot of things to change. So Heather and I talked a lot about how your brain works and how that might change for you. Here's the good news, though. We always like to leave you on a little bit of a high note, is our brains are plastic, which means that we can learn how to recreate those synaptic neurons that maybe didn't get hardwired when we're young. We can learn new ways to do things, and well up into our 70s by this study, which means that we can do something about it.
Yes, thank you, Tiffany. And that means that we do have positive to talk about. I always want to remind people that when we do come in and do a training, that it's not just all the negative, that there are things that we can do to help. And so I invite you to use your chat feature again and list ways in which you see resilience, whether it's within your community, whether it's within some that you've been working with, whether it's in yourself. What do you see as resilience and what does it mean to you? And as you guys are typing, feel free to take your time to type up. But I want you to know like what the technical definition of resilience is. And it is the capacity to be able to spring back, successfully adapt in the face of adversity, and develop social, academic, and vocational competence despite being exposed to extreme stress or simply the stress that is inherent in today's world. Yes, we're getting some great things, getting back up after you fall, building character. Your children are resilient. That's so huge. Like all of that is huge, empowering each other. You know, Tiffany spoke earlier about we all have a reason why we went into the job field that we went into, and mine is empowerment. I love to empower people. If I can find one person here to really empower you and be able to provide that for the next person, then I did my job today. So then we're going to go on to a little film. It's a short film, and it shows us about both positive and negative experiences and how, like Tiffany said, our brain continues to grow and mold throughout our lives, and how that can change us and really change the outcomes of that.
Resilience is the result of a highly interactive process between individual characteristics in the person and the environment in which that individual has developed.
It's really the counterbalancing of difficult things that may exist in the child's life with positive things that occur within the family, but even positive things that may exist in the community.
An easy way of thinking about resilience is like a scale with a fulcrum in the middle of it. And there are things on both sides of that scale, experiences of both bad things or good things.
Our genes shape where the fulcrum is positioned at the start.
There are certain genes that make a child more sensitive to the effects of maltreatment or parental neglect or witnessing violence.
The fulcrum may start out kind of more towards one side or more towards the other side, and that's going to make a big difference in terms of how much these subsequent events affect things positively or negatively.
Science tells us that experience moves the fulcrum, for better or for worse.
Even though we are born with genes, genes will respond differently to certain environmental situations as opposed to others.
What the genes are actually doing are turning up or turning down the expression of chemicals in circuits in the brain and the circuitry in the entire body that govern our responses to stress, to anxiety, to depressive symptoms.
When positive experiences accumulate and children learn coping skills that help them to manage stress, the fulcrum can slide, so the scale tilts toward positive outcomes more easily. That's what resilience is all about.
There's always an adult, or more than one adult, who is key to providing that relationship that helps to build resilience.
Thank you for sharing that. I love that video because, you know, it's that one adult, it's that one person, and it's how we respond. As mentioned earlier, I do have a background in child welfare and addictions, and knowing that, seeing that person come into your office after a bad week, and they could have skipped your appointment, they could have been a no call, no show, but they came in, and I would thank them. Thank you for coming in today. How I responded to them mattered, and how we respond to people we work with matters. And so it is something as simple as saying, thank you. Thank you for coming today. I understand that it was hard, that you didn't want to, that you could have chosen the different path, but you decided to come down this path. I will empower you and I will help you in every way that I can. And so knowing that how we respond matters is really going to help build that resiliency for our clients, for ourselves, for our communities, for everyone involved. So we're going to talk about reinforcing loops. And so after what we just watched with that film, knowing that we want to create immediate change sounds outstanding. Like, I would love to be able to change the world today and have no more addictions and no more gun violence and global warming or anything else that you want to say, but we can't do it all today, and we can't do it just immediately. So we know that it takes time, and that it really takes us changing one person at a time. And so when you look at, like, if you're running a group or anything like that, knowing that, you know what, I maybe didn't make an impact on every single person in this group, but I made an impact on that one person. And that person is going to go out and say, I need to change my life. And I want to do it for my kids, for my grandkids, for the future generations. And that is really how reinforcing loops look. And so we can look at that vicious reinforcing loop or the virtuous, and how they truly lead us down those two different paths. And so, like I said, I always thanked my clients because it was, you chose the path to come and see me. Whether you wanted to be here or not, you chose that. And so knowing that under the vicious path of that reinforcing loop, it takes us down that reject or eject path, which means that it continually leads us to a different adversities. Whether we are out of a childhood where it's not adverse childhood experiences, it's taking us out of that. It's continually wrapping us around that adversity loop. It is continuing that cycle. And it doesn't build us up, but it puts us exactly where we were. And it leads us down a shameful path. I mean, I remember I have clients that are standing out in my mind as I speak right now, thinking about, they continually went down that path and didn't have that person to help them pull them out. And they were embarrassed by it. It was, they would come into my office and tell me, I relapsed and I didn't know what to do. And this was the easiest thing for me because everybody wanted me to do that. I didn't have anyone. And so knowing that we can really lead people down that virtuous path, and it does the opposite. It empowers us to make changes for the positive in our lives and in our clients' lives or anyone else you're working with. I mean, it can be the person at McDonald's that hands you your food and you can say thank you. That little bit can really change. Um, oh, you use relatives. Perfect. I can change up my verbiage for the day. Not a problem. I've heard that before, actually. But knowing that we are able to change somebody's day or change their life by the simple things. So understanding that as ACEs go, as people grow, and how our brains are able to re-hardwire things, we are able to change that path. And depending on who we have on our side will determine which path we go down. So really knowing that as much as, like I said, as much as we want to change the world today, if we can change one person's life, that is changing the world. So then when we talk about serve, this is when we're managing vicarious trauma and building resilience, and there's different components to addressing this. And so one simple thing you can do is share. Share the behaviors that are normal for abnormal stress. Share that, you know what, it is okay. This is okay. So focus on you, individual strengths, empower yourself, and make decisions. Clearly express your positive qualities and be genuine about your praise. So when you do have that relative who comes into your office and you are just, you want to thank them, but you don't know how, be genuine with it. Anyone can pick up whether somebody's being genuine or not. So really be genuine. Build that sense of physical safety, emotional security. Allow for expression of emotions and have healthy relationships. So allow that relative to come in and have that emotional safety, knowing that if they disclose something to you, it is okay. That there's not going to be judgment. There's not going to be repercussion because they said something. Knowing that they are safe is huge. Demonstrate how behaviors impact others. Recognize a caring person and the importance of community. So if you are able to model that, it really shows a lot. And I like to think of this, I have, like I said, a baby on the way, but I also have 2 stepkids. And I love to model what a positive relationship is with them because they didn't see that with their dad and their mom. And so knowing that sometimes if we can just model that little bit of a positive behavior or a caring person, like, oh, you scraped your knee, I'm here for you. Knowing that that is something that they have and that they have that connection with is huge. Stress the importance of serving others. Create opportunities for a child to contribute. So create opportunities for your relatives in your groups to contribute, to be able to help that person who just came in. I used to run an IOP, intensive outpatient group, and it was an open group. So every day it felt like there was somebody new coming in, but it was always building up that person who was about to graduate and help that newcomer who was too scared to say, I'm here and I have a problem, or I'm here and I don't want to be here, but I'm forced to be here. Being able to really build up that strength within each other is huge. Model effective coping. Guide the child or your relative to develop those positive coping skills. I love talking about coping skills, and it's one of my favorite things, but essentially anything can be a coping skill if we think about it. But being able to really model that effective coping, so whether you are struggling with something yourself and you walk into a group, be able to work through that with them. Work through that, show that vulnerability, but yet also be able to really just, you know what, this is what I'm doing. It might not be effective for you, but this is what is effective for me. And help your child or your relative really understand that discipline is about guiding and teaching. and teach them about the impacts of choices. Essentially, we all make choices. That is my little 4.5-year-old's favorite thing, is telling her brother when he makes a bad choice that, well, we all make choices in life. Knowing that, yes, we do all make choices in life, whether it was we went to Buffalo Wild Wings and you ordered a cheeseburger, now you're sitting there sad looking at everybody else's chicken wings, or, you decided that picking up that needle tonight was the right decision for you. We all make choices, and knowing that there's an impact of those choices, whether it's on you directly or on your surrounding people that are in your network. So then I invite you again to use the chat box, because I love hearing everybody else's chats, but resiliency is such a powerful thing that each of us carry inside of us. So I wanted you to take a few minutes and write down what you're doing in all of these spaces, or if you are like, oh, under physical, this is what I'm doing for resilience, then write it down, share it with others, because it really helps us if we can see what others are doing. And so what are you doing for your own resilience? And understanding that we're talking about a very holistic approach, and that it will change us all for the better. And we cannot help others until we've learned how to help ourselves. And so Tiffany kind of threw in that little snippet about self-care earlier, and I'll throw it back. Like, we have to care for ourselves before we can care for others. And so knowing that under physical, it might be nutrition, it might be exercise. If you're that person that loves to work out because it releases those endorphins, good for you. Like, more power to you. Because that's not where I'm at by any means. But that is an example of physical. Yes, walking outside, being mindful of nature, the sounds, different animals and birds. That's so huge. We actually woke up to birds chirping yesterday, and it was like, oh, as much as I wish it was not 4 a.m. and you were chirping, it was so nice to hear that. Prayer, being with children and grandchildren. Isn't it funny how those littles just like will brighten up your day completely? Breathing exercises are huge. We always did meditation as we ended our groups, because it really helped us to be able to relax, to debrief, rest, under emotional self-awareness. It's asking for help. It's saying, I'm overwhelmed. I need help right now. This is too much. Keeping that balance, learning that it is okay to literally write down in your planner, I need to do self-care today. I am when I talk about writing it down, I literally have that physical planner, because that's who I am. And so knowing that, keeping that balance under spiritual, somebody already mentioned prayer, which is so great. Like I said, meditation. Somebody else mentioned that listening to those animals. If Tiffany would have been done about 2 minutes sooner, you would have heard the dogs barking next door, because yep, it's that time of day where they get to be let out and they bark all around. Fasting, worship, service, confession. It all really depends on what helps you, but knowing that, yes, sitting in silence with your 2 dogs on your lap. Isn't it funny how dogs are they're just so wonderful. They know you so well. But knowing that those domains of resilience, we just listed off a bunch of them, and they're not the typical, oh, you have to say no, you have to do this. It is things such as that feeling of that fresh air and understanding those smells. Help build that resilience, help build that inside of you. And like I said, you can't help others until you've learned how to help yourselves. So then we'll look at the 4 R's of trauma-informed care. And so this is the last one that I will be asking you to use the chat for. Doesn't mean that Tiffany won't be asking you to use the chat anymore. But please feel free to use the chat, and let's find out, what does trauma-informed mean to you? how are you guys using trauma-informed within your agencies, within the organizations that you work? I love this because at Children's Home, we're really big on trauma-informed and how can we better ourselves within our agency? And so, like I said, sometimes some of this stuff is just bouncing it off as, oh, I never even thought of that to begin with for myself. And so taking a look at the 4 R's of trauma-informed, as you guys are typing into the chat box, they are realize, recognize, respond, and resist. So realize the impacts of trauma and the potential paths for recovery, knowing that trauma isn't a you are doomed forever. It is, sorry, I have the hiccups. It is knowing that you're able to change that path. Recognize and understand the signs and the symptoms of trauma and the others involved within that system. Knowing that trauma for me and how I portray it is going to look differently than it does for Tiffany. The way that I carry my trauma with me is different. Respond. I mean, know what trauma is. Understand that. Understand what your policy and your procedures are within your organization. And resist. Re-traumatization, goodness, that's a hard word today, of children, as well as the adults who care for them. So try not to re-traumatize those children. Try not to re-traumatize our relatives that we're working with by making them go down that same path. It's how can we build you up from where you're at versus we have to take you down 4 pegs before we can really start building you up.
Thanks, Heather. So we started the beginning of this training talking about a collaborative resilience conversation. Gosh, I came up with the title and I can't even remember it. Is where will you take this information? Next week, when Heather and I have the opportunity to be back, I hope that you'll join us as we dive a little bit deeper into specific about building up the individual. But right now we want to focus on the big picture. What we know about how trauma is impacting our communities. The things that so many of us work to support and engage and empower those that are around us. What does leadership expansion really mean, right? High capacity or high healing communities consider everyone who wants to help as a leader and create opportunities for people to contribute their gifts and talents to those commonly held goals. Now, I asked earlier what barriers when we were talking about individual versus community. One of the barriers that we often see take place in communities is there's not a sense of shared language or common understanding about what the issues really are, or what it looks like for those that are living through this daily experience. Those that are walking alongside individuals often aren't being given a space to share and advocate for those relatives that they're partnering with. But it really means that leadership really means having diverse perspectives to enrich solutions, enhance resources available for our community improvement. Not a single one of us is going to completely eradicate the opioid epidemic, but collectively, we could do some things, right? We could make some difference. So even something as simple as offering thoughts about how do we keep our children safe? How are the children doing, right? And healthy is an important form of leadership that fuels a community's ability to respond. So when you think about your role, you are all leaders in this space, whether you're directly serving those that are struggling with substance misuse, or if you are advocating for policy changes or decriminalizing or restorative justice, or however this shows up for you, you are all leaderships in this space. The second phase of building community capacity or changing this on a community level, I want to pause here and note that you will not hear Heather or I give recommendations on how this should look for you. We are not the experts for your community. We are not the experts for your lived experiences. We're simply here humbly to offer some thoughts and some perspective about how other communities have really created a shift in change. Taking all of the information that you've been collecting through this series, for example, and putting it into practice. So when we talk about this next phase of coming together around issues that matter, people are hardwired for connection. We have an instinctive need to be together. When we're together, we're more easily able to find each other's strengths and act upon them. This idea of otherness is what keeps us divided. I don't remember who said it in the chat earlier, but one of the barriers in communities is just not being united. So again, I echo back that shared language and understanding about really what's at play here, really what's at the root of these issues. Conversations that matter to community members build social networks. An important factor for resilience is being able to connect with others who are passionate about things that you are also passionate about. Sharing perspectives and looking at activities as they are true for those within the community that have experienced them. To gain that common view of how people in the community are working through their lives. When we come together on issues like adverse childhood experiences, substance misuse, grief, loss, racism, it holds space for all of us as leaders to talk about, okay, what are we going to do about it? How do we create safety in order for our relatives to heal? When we think about some of the things that need to change at the systematic level, is understanding that those with lived experience need to be at the table and part of those conversations. That a top-down approach is not going to be what shifts the dynamic. We have to look to the experts within the individual communities and hold them up and create space and get out of the way sometimes and let those that have that lived experience talk about what they need to have changed in order to find healing. And that includes our youth as well. The third phase is really about sharing and learning. What will you take with you when you leave today? Will you be like, gosh, I hope you'll say, gosh, that was a great presentation. Glad I went to it. Or will you share in a conversation? Will you start maybe doing your own research on ACEs? Will you come back and will you learn more? It's really important that we share our lived experiences and what we know and learn with others to create opportunities to combine resources or to achieve goals more easily. Like I said, not one of us will achieve this goal of addressing these community-wide issues on our own. And something as simple as having another perspective at the table gives us the diversity in that scope to say, gosh, I never thought about it that way. I never really looked at it from that perspective. When we share perspective, cultural differences, common values, or even just a general interest in caring in one another, I realized I got so passionate about talking and I didn't move my slides. It becomes easier for us to ask for help. It becomes easier for us to notice how we can help others. And families benefit from that. Families become more stable when there is that sense of reciprocity or that give and receive and flow of community life. And some of your communities, I'm sure, do it so well, where it's really a way of life. It's a cultural practice for so many, and encouraging others in the community to see the benefit of that give and take and that flow of how we connect. That allows us to start making decisions that are really in the best interest of others, that help us learn from where we have come from and figure out what do we want to do for future generations. So again, in the chat, somebody talked about future generations. The idea behind adverse childhood experiences or the ACE interface curriculum was really about how do we pass less stuff, less trauma, less experiences, less issues in our tissues onto the next generation? How do we just disrupt that transmission? Looking at those communities that are really functioning together and well, it's not about blame or failure. They know that sometimes we're not going to get it right the first time. They choose to think about those opportunities to fail forward. How do we improve upon what's working now, what isn't working? Letting go of what's not working is an important process of that, like not hanging on to things because it's how we've always done it. As we make these decisions together and experience these community improvements, they develop that sense of belonging and shared identity. It brings us back together for the next cycle of how we're going to improve and how we're going to come together, right? So in Walla Walla, Washington, there was a study done that looked at having support and hope. As a professional who's been in this a while, I know that there are times that I have felt frustrated, or I felt like I wasn't making a difference, or that I wasn't impacting the lives of others. And certainly not from a place about me, but from a place about like I had failed them on some level. So knowing that idea of really what encourages change, what makes a difference and resonates with others as they're moving through their world. So Walla Walla, Washington did this study, I think it was like 2009 to 2011, and they got together a group of individuals and they asked questions based on how often do you feel supported and hopeful about your future? Was it always or usually versus rarely or never? So I'd like for you to think about that for yourself. I won't ask you to put it in the chat box. I won't ask you to share that information, but think about, in the past 30 days, how often did I feel like I had support or was hopeful? Can you answer that always or usually? Or do you find yourself saying rarely or never? So this particular study looked at 4 resilience factors in terms of processing through this. They said, they defined social, emotional support and hope, right? The feeling supported and hopeful. Did these individuals have 2 or more people who help and provide concrete help, so not just help in general? So it's important to understand that some of the best advice I've ever received professionally and personally was, don't tell me to call you. Tell me what I'm supposed to call you for. Should I call Heather when I can't make my mortgage payment? Should I call Tosha when I'm curled up on the floor at 2 a.m. and I'm crying and I don't know what else to do? Tell me, what am I supposed to call you for? Because we're in our moments of trauma. We're stricken with grief and anxiety and all of these other emotions. It is shameful to ask for help. And those of us that need it the most are going to be the least likely to ask for it. But if I know that I can call Heather to cover a training for me when I'm having a bad day, I'm more likely to ask for that help. So having concrete help. Community reciprocity is watching out for children and intervening when they're in trouble, even when they're not your children. Understanding that this is a community of practice, right? I have a Girl Scout troop, for example, and I have 13 girls. Those girls are my girls. If at any point those girls needed me and their parents were not intervening, I'm going to reach out and I'm going to get them the help that they need. Social bridging is a little bit more difficult for individuals as they process through reaching outside of their social circle, right? If I have a mistrust of the system for whatever reason, but I care enough about Susie to make the call, I'm going to make the call to get her intervention and help. This whole study was really looking at what are the impacts of positive experiences for these adults. They found that even individuals who had high ACE scores, who have who did not have these positive supports in place were at a higher risk of health risks and health problems. Individuals with even high trauma scores or high ACE scores were less likely to struggle with difficult symptoms when they had these resilience factors in place. And so let's take a look at what this looks like. And the reason I love sharing this with a group like yourselves, your diverse group of professionals and lived experience, is that what you're doing, you don't have to have any initials behind your name to offer support and hope to other people, right? It's just being a good relative. It's being a good human being. But I want to show you some tangible research about how it shows up for people and how important it is. So individuals with high ACEs who were struggling with or who were smoking, when they reported having low support and hope with a high ACE score of 4 to 8, this particular population, 36% of them struggled with their smoking, right? When they had high support and hope, they were less likely to smoke, less likely to face that adversity. So that 36% drops all the way down to 27%. So it wasn't shame or don't smoke, it's not good for you. It wasn't any of that language. It was having support and hope that helped reduce this issue for them. Let's take it another one. So this one's probably my most favorite to show because it has the largest impact. So what we know about mental health, and again, honoring the experts that are in the room, in the virtual room today, we know how many challenges can come out of an individual who is struggling with mental health issues. So individuals with high ACE scores of a 4 to 8, 8% of them struggled with poor mental health for more than half of the previous month because of having low support and hope. Think about February 2021 for you. And perhaps this was your actual experience. So I hold space for that. And if it wasn't, imagine how much harder daily activities would be if I was struggling with my mental health for more than half of the month, right? It gets harder to show up to work. It gets harder to pay bills. It gets harder to interact. It's just hard, right? But people like you, people that care enough to learn more, to share, to show up, this is what you can do. You take that 38% and you drop it all the way down to 9%. You do that. Every time you show up, every time you are a reinforcing positive loop, every time you ask a question of how can I help? How did we get here? You make a big impact. And although we may never see the results of how we showed up for people, know that it matters. So even something like poor health or having poor health, individuals with high ACE scores reported poor physical health for more than half the last month because of not having support or hope. Now, physical health, of course, can be chronic pain issues, lung issues, asthma issues. This can be things where chronic illness is showing up and creating more adversity for that person and getting their daily lives moving. Again, just by offering help, right? So this is a little bit different than hope and support. This is having concrete help, people they can call out to and ask for assistance. That 41% drops all the way down to, I'd say, like 17%. And that's a huge difference when we think about quality of life within our communities. So if you think back to that oil slick slide and think about all the things that are interrelated, how might offering hope, support, and help change the way that your communities work? So I am going to ask you to jump in the chat box, and I'd like to hear your reflection on those slides that I just shared. Any thoughts or feelings about those, any aha moments or reflections on how this maybe is already showing up in the spaces that you're in. Heather, I'm going to ask for your feedback while they're typing, or I hope they're typing.
Yes. So for me, I, like you said, the mental health one is huge because, like, that's just support. That is sometimes being that person that you have that goes into that appointment or drives you to that appointment is sometimes that support that you need to say, okay, I can get on the right path. And so for me, that one is the one that really resonates with me because, like you said, it's the biggest change. I mean, you look at it and it's massive.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Understanding that how all of these things are interconnected and interrelated, just by helping in the space that we're in can make a big difference for the community as a whole. So again, I echo my continued sentiment, which is this cannot be a top-down approach. If we truly want to create changes, even within systems, we have to include the voices of many, the voices of individuals who have lived that experience, who have a different perspective of our own. It's important to not be siloed or isolated when we're seeking advice or feedback on how do we change our communities, how do we change specific social problems or just general responses as a whole. The way systems work often is that it's that top-down approach where the justice system has a way of responding, education system, community services, everybody has their way of doing work, but they don't necessarily talk to each other or collaborate in a way that makes sense or that is honoring the individuals that need those services. We have to include those that have been affected by ACEs, which is all of us. This is an us conversation. We have to include those voices at the table to create changes within those systems that make them more effective. Now, granted, there will always be things that we can't change. I think of the justice system, which is very difficult to change sometimes. But the more we connect and collaborate and rise up to meet that top-down approach, we can start to create solutions that actually move the space for those that are trying to find healing and move forward. You guys made it. So we have plenty of time. I certainly want to honor the amount of time that you've dedicated to this already, but I do want to hold space for any questions or thoughts that you may have. I'm so appreciative of your time, but you again can use the Q&A for any questions or the chat box. We would be receptive to any thoughts or feelings to this content. Or you can have 20 minutes back in your day and use it for self-care. Yes, please go check out and see all of that good information that Tosha just shared.
Looks like we don't have any questions. Folks are ready to go. So thank you all for joining. Thank you, Tiffany and Heather, for the wonderful information. We look forward to continuing the conversation next week. If you haven't already, please fill out our survey. I put the link in a chat box. I also added some more information if folks need to contact who or what for CEUs or other questions. And for those who want to see past webinars or see what the next upcoming topics are, I posted our webpage link, and so that is updated by every Friday with the most recent webinar. Our webinars are also available on the Great Plains Tribal Leaders Health Board Facebook page after they are recorded. And yeah, thank you all for coming. And oh, we do have a question.
Yeah, Jalen had a question about suggesting or how to implement this in your community, and I just encouraged her to reach out to me directly because it's a pretty involved kind of next steps. But I would love to connect and talk to you about what other communities have done and how just offer you some connections in that space.
Yes, and I definitely encourage folks to check out the Children's Home Society's website and see what other trainings are out there. I have attended sexual assault or child violence and sexual assault training in the past, and it's just been amazing and eye-opening. So
thanks for that, Shauna.
I think with that, we, unless there's any other questions, we can close out the session for today.
Great. Well, thank you all, and please take care of yourselves.
Yes, thank you, everyone.